Thank you for joining us for yet another very important discussion on the mid-year report 2022. I'm your host, Shaquan Gill, and for this discussion, I have two very important, brilliant men with me for this discussion today. Those persons are none other than Mr. Richard Rambaran, who is Executive Director of the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industries, rather, and an economist, as well as Mr. Joel Bagwandin, who is a financial analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Shaquan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. So, as we start our conversation, as we know, we're talking about the mid-year report, a report that has riches in terms of information, statistics about Guyana's economy. I want to hear your thoughts, both of you, and I'll start with Richard. Your thoughts on the mid-year report and what it says to you.
Sure. So thank you, Shaquan, and of course, I appreciate you interviewing me here today and bringing me on your program. The first thing that I want to say is, of course, that the mid-year report is a demonstration actually of where we are at the half point. And so the numbers that are in there are not a complete picture of the entire fiscal year, because naturally the fiscal year has not come to an end. But I think what importantly the mid-year report demonstrates is that economic growth in Guyana, both from the oil sector, but perhaps more importantly, for the non-oil sector, remains positive. Now, let me attack what, of course, has already come out in the public domain frontally as it relates to the mid-year report. I would have personally noticed that you have seen some comments emanating in the public domain that the mid-year report is an indication, what's happening in there is an indication of the fact that Guyana is already being besieged by natural resources curse, more specifically in the form of Dutch disease. Now, I want to say, if one does a disaggregation of the economic sectors and you take a closer look at what has happened, you'll find that there still exists growth more strongly in non-traditional sectors than has ever been had in Guyana. So when you look at things like other crops, when you look at livestock, bauxite, you look at wholesale and retail, all of those subsectors, very important labor-intensive subsectors, continue to grow. It is no small secret that the first half of this year globally was besieged by a number of quite catastrophic events. Much of the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, much of the fallout of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the supply chain crisis, etc. What that, of course, did was create adverse economic conditions, and if international economic conditions, and if you have an economy that is still experiencing positive rates of economic growth in a global context where economic prospects are dampened, then you have an economy which, in my view and my professional opinion, speaks volumes to the macroeconomic management. We have also, in addition to that, been able to contain inflation in Guyana to less than the global average, hovering somewhere around 5 to 6%, which is below the global average, and the prospects for it remain also below the global average. This is at a time when you have economies that are pushing 9, 10, and upward in 10% inflation. And so I think the mid-year report really is a testament and a demonstration of what prudent macroeconomic management looks like. If you look at perhaps Kaieteur News' front page most recently, where you would have seen a number of sectors in decline: rice, sugar, gold. Let me deal with those three in particular, because those three, of course, are some big hitters.
Yeah.
Sugar, rice, and gold, all of them, the way that they are done in Guyana is highly dependent on favorable weather conditions.
Yeah.
And if you are facing a situation where an external factor, an exogenous factor such as weather, has been inclement and compounded by global conditions, prevailing global conditions, but more specifically inclement weather, you are dealing with an economy then that is suffering from that, not as a result of any internal policies to destabilize or to have a mitigating impact on the sector.
Right.
And so I want to say that the proponents of that construct, that Guyana is somehow already suffering from natural resources curse, in my view, I don't think that they truly understand the concept, and I don't think that a careful and thorough analysis and disaggregation of the structures of the economy has been done so as to be able to ascertain that fact. I'll start from there and preface my remarks with that.
Mr. Bagwandin, 36.4% growth is what we've seen from the mid-year report. From a financial perspective, as a financial analyst too, what are your thoughts as it relates to the mid-year report?
So thank you again for having me here. And Richard gave an excellent preamble as to where we are and what this mid-year report reflects. To extend on Richard, he mentioned the subsectors that would have recorded positive growth. So they're the main sectors, and then like agriculture, for example, is made up of sugar, rice, livestock, other crops, and so on. Now, I want to share share a little story quickly.
Sure.
I was in a barbershop a few days ago, and Richard didn't mention one of the other sectors that did extremely well. We're in inflationary times. There is this big cry that government should do more to cushion. Government has already done more. In a previous program, I would have shown that when you look quantitatively of the measures that the government has implemented, if you do an analysis for the past 2 years, it's equivalent to more than 170% of the natural resource fund balance as of 2021. So government has already done to the extent they can do to cushion the effects. And, with the external shocks, global eventualities, supply chain, we regurgitate these things so often. Still, there is this, not to discount the importance of the rising cost of living and how we should deal with it. But on one of my programs here, I said, we also as a people, we have our part to play in terms of adjustments to our lifestyle. So a few days ago in the barbershop, I was waiting for my turn, and the photographer, professional photographer, was in the chair, and he was telling the barber, he was sharing a story with the barber. He had a wedding just the weekend before, elaborate wedding. This wedding cost about approximately $5 million, based on the venue and that it was held, right? And he said these people, the host for the wedding, they don't mind paying for the fancy venue and $5,000 per plate of food and for the fancy shoes. Nothing is wrong with that. But those things will disappear the next day. Yeah. The food, the shoe, everything will disappear the next day. And for his service, which is a professional photographer, taking all the pictures at the right angle and the videography and all of that, which is something that is there to stay for as long, right? They want to beat down his price, right? Now, that is a classic example to show people have their priorities mixed up, right? And if you look at the same report, you would see, while we're crying out for cost of living, entertainment went up. It didn't decline. Entertainment went up. Retail and food trade, wholesale went up. Positive growth compared to the previous year. So that's to extend on that. Now, I want to also comment on the same headline in the Kaitro News, which was a commentary by the chief economic spokesperson for the opposition. And I concur with Richard that a thorough analysis was not done. And I would go further to say there is a lack of a thorough understanding. Now, let me explain something to you. It takes this building. To build this building, it takes months to build it. To build a community, to build a housing scheme with all the infrastructure, the roads, and to populate it, it takes about 5 years to build up a community. And we can see this. We've seen Diamond, for example. We've seen all the other housing schemes too, showing how long it took to build. Years. To destroy it, it could be destroyed in a split second. A fire could destroy an entire line of buildings within seconds, right? We saw the effects of the war in Ukraine, what infrastructure, public infrastructure, private property in that country that took years to build was destroyed in a split second with bombs, right? And that invasion. Now, I say this for the viewers to understand where this economy came from, what we have built, and what we are rebuilding. So in 1992, we came out. When this government first got elected in a democracy transition to a free market economy, a different type of political system, we were virtually a bankrupt state. That the GDP ratio was more than 100%. And so at the time, our GDP was about 200 million, right? Per capita income was about less than 200 US dollars. So it took us 22 years, from 1992 to 2014, to build this economy, to move it from 200 million to 4 billion US. It took us 22 decades, 2 decades to do that, right? In 2015, the previous administration, in summary, inherited $100 billion liquid cash in the bank. They inherited 595 million US, close to 600 million US in foreign reserve, which represented at the time 5 months worth of import cover. It means it's enough money to pay for 5 months of our import, the goods we import from the rest of the world. The debt to GDP ratio was below 50%, right? The traditional sectors were doing well, right? If you do a comparison, right, for the period, let's say 2009 to 2014, cumulatively, excluding gold, and anybody could do this. Open an Excel sheet and go to the Bank of Guyana report and look at export figures, or the Bureau of Stats. It has it already in Excel. So you just have to put it in the format you want and do your tabulation. I exclude gold because gold carried this economy for quite a while. So take gold out of the equation and look at our export, non-traditional, traditional export earnings: sugar, rice, livestock, forestry, timber, fish, and those type of stuff, molasses, rum, right? From 2009 to 2014, cumulatively, it amounted to $624 billion. So the growth altogether for these line items of export items, right, grew by 41%. Now the corresponding period, 2015 to 2020, similar exercise, right? There was a loss of $67 billion. That's 322 million US. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the economic policies for the past 5 years destroyed what we have built in 2 decades, right? Today, Richard was showing me last night when we were looking at a report, Richard snapshot and send the reserve balance. It's 1.2 months import cover. So I went and I did some digging. I said, we have 1.2 months import cover because we've destroyed all these sectors for the past, from 2015 to 2020. So if we lose 322 million that we had 5 years before then, that 322 million US represents 1.1 month import cover. And then if you had continued with this same expansionary policy and private sector driven building the infrastructure, of course those sectors would do better. By now we would have already have the hydropower, cheaper electricity, if all those things went through. And so you'd have more export earnings, more reserve, a stronger reserve. So with that said, what the mid-year report reflects, it reflects the outcome of the economic policies, the fiscal policies that were implemented through budget 2020, 2021, and 2022. Right? That is what it reflects, the outcome of that. And to move the non-oil sectors from 2020 to negative growth, that is commendable. It means we are on the path of rebuilding. Now, it took 5 years to destroy 22 years. We now have to take another 5 or 10 years to rebuild where we were in 2014 and then build on top of that.
Understood. Mr. Rambaran, we talk about financial policies, we talk about policies in general, and I need to ask you guys, when we look at the mid-year report and we see all of the trajectories that we've seen in the mid-year report, what would you say are some of the most pivotal interventions that government has taken, you can within that 6 month period, or even from 2020 to 2022, that really allowed the country and the economy to grow in the way that it did. Mr. Rembrandt, I'll start with you.
So let me just start by one that I have traditionally always spoken about. History would record that for as far back as 2017, 2018, I have been on public record as saying that we need to ensure we utilize the excise tax and the adjustment in excise tax on fuel so as to ensure that we smooth out the cyclical volatility associated with oil prices. The government of Guyana moving excise tax firstly from 30 down to 20, 20 to 10, and then 10 to 0%, now 0%, demonstrates that there is an understanding of the role that fuel as an important input to the productive process has to play. In the sense that what high oil prices, the impact that that can have as a pass-through to the economy and all of the intermediary services, etc., that are offered, the impact that that can have is debilitating. So in the first instance, I want to mention that I believe that the reduction of the excise tax to 0% was an excellent move, and it is one which certainly the private sector commends. Now, international oil prices are back on the way down, and we will at some point in time in the near future see the stabilization of price once again to perhaps not necessarily where it was pre-pandemic, but somewhere thereabouts in the near term. So that is the first. The second that I want to say is that if you look, demonstrated by the mid-year report, if you look at what's been happening in the construction and infrastructure related sectors, I think that the emphasis that the administration has placed on construction as well as infrastructure has really driven a strong multiplier effect throughout the rest of the economy. And I've said this quite often, that infrastructure as well as the act of construction or the subsector of construction has such a broad-based multiplier effect. It is perhaps, well not perhaps, it is from empirical work that we have done. It is the greatest impact to the economy. It does have the greatest multiplier effect in the economy. And the level of importance that is being placed on it, it is clearly demonstrative. The mid-year report, for example, shows it. Now, what it does also, construction and infrastructure, it creates the conditions under which the country can create the physical stock of asset to then propel further growth. Because as you're aware, we have an expansive geography. You have persons who are living in hinterland communities, you have time lost in traffic,
right.
You have a real deficit of infrastructure that has happened historically. And so we are really on the way to building out Guyana. And that by itself demonstrates what has been happening. I believe that the cash grants that are being granted, it also helps to be able to stimulate from the demand side. If you pay keen attention to what's happening in the economy, you would know that at this juncture there is a shortage of labor, whether it be skilled, semi-skilled, or unskilled labor, which really speaks towards a good absorption and take-up of the labor force in Guyana. But you also do have a category of persons who have not upskilled or retooled themselves quickly enough for the economy. They're currently on the way to doing that through the intervention of the Gold Program, etc., and the other build-outs of the Gold Program focused on TVET. They are on the way to doing that. But those persons receiving cash grants and demand-side stimulus, it really speaks volumes to an understanding of macroeconomic management, because we are in a position where enterprises thriving, persons who are employed in enterprise, they are thriving, but then you have also a group of persons that are in transition for this upskilling. Those persons receiving some amount of cash handout, whether it be for COVID, whether it be for retooling, whether it be for loss due to climatic conditions, etc. It then speaks to the fact that injections are happening from the demand side and strong demand is occurring. And that truly, for me, is demonstrative of the fact that, as an individual, consumers in the country are benefiting and consumer confidence exists. That on the flip side is demonstrated too by the numbers in wholesale and retail trade, and the numbers in wholesale and retail trade going up. So those three interventions thus far that I would have mentioned, those for me are some of the most poignant interventions that have been made. I also do believe this is extraordinarily important, perhaps more important than we sometimes give it credit for, that the government's setting of freight charges to pre-pandemic level is an intervention which has mitigated a further price increase or inflationary circumstance in Guyana. And it is a public fact that cost of living has risen somewhat in Guyana, but I shudder to think, in absentia of that intervention, what cost of living perhaps could have been.
Yeah.
Now, I figure that you will ask eventually about the outlook for the global economy and for the Guyanese economy, but let me just stick a bit in right here. As we begin to progress along the continuum of time, you'll find that those prices will begin to approach pre-pandemic levels. Some of them already are. And eventually, that is going to make its way through to the economy. And so the dampened prospects that many other economies have been having as a result of an absence of macroeconomic management, it's not applicable in the context of Guyana.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that we have been able to bridge a variety of areas. And what is especially important is that you have an administration that is cognizant of, as well as taking policy measures and definitive actions in a variety of sectors and subsectors as is required.
So as a brief summary, so you're saying the interventions that are specific and stood out to you, the three, would be the excise tax, interventions, and the other one.
So the excise tax, the focus on construction, the reduction of freight to pre-pandemic level, and the handouts or cash grants, if preferably, to the affected and vulnerable groups. Those four for me are the four most poignant that I have seen that really respond to the economic context.
Mr. Bagwandin, how about you?
Yeah, those that Richard mentioned are the key intervention in the prevailing economic circumstance with rising cost of living coming out of COVID pandemic. Then, in addition, complementing those, or in addition to those, you have the fiscal policies that were also implemented through the budgetary mechanism to support what Richard was explaining. If you want to drive the construction sector, then construction equipment, you need to incentivize that, reduce the cost. So you had some taxes removed, VAT removed on construction equipment, mining equipment. You also see that the government has a very hands-on approach to working with the financial institutions to drive their housing programs. And when for the lay person looking at this program, when Richard speak of the multiplier effect, what that simply means, let's take the young professional housing program, for example, a few hundreds, right? Now, a young professional, take myself or like Richard, we would, most of us would live in a household with our parents. And in that household, you have probably 2 or 3 persons who are bringing in income, who are earning. And so that's your household income. And so as these young professionals move on to live their own independent lives, that's how an income earner is moving to inhabit a new community. So in this community now, you will have the need for a supermarket. You would have the need for a pharmacy. You would have the need for a daycare. You have the need for a school, fire service, and all these public. So there's public service, which would extension of public service, providing employment for the people in that community. There would be private enterprises, supermarkets, pharmacies, a gym, and those type of stuff for the people in that community. So that's when we speak of the multiplier effect. And then the people, you still have construction ongoing. So the laborers, they're earning as well, and they're growing. People need to move, transportation, right? And so that's how when we speak of the multiplier effect in economics and finance and expansion, that is what it means, multiplying the world. You look at the growth of the money supply as well, that has also expanded. It means there is more money injected in the economy, more people earning, more people taking loans from the bank and spending more. So it means that's driving up the demand. And so you see there is a multi-pronged approach, across all sectors to expand and to drive growth in all these sectors that are going to contribute collectively to the overall expansion of the economy. In terms of the other sectors that didn't do well, agriculture is a particular sector globally that you will have natural setbacks. And if you read the report, rice contracted because of the flood. I mean, rice don't grow overnight again, right? Sugar don't grow overnight. It takes months, it takes investment, and you see the government would have injected as well $1 billion in for the farmers, cash grant, and those type of stuff to help with the recovery. So you're gonna have, especially agriculture-driven countries are heavily subsidized all over, in all the countries, naturally because of those natural events that you can't. But you see the other sectors, you're seeing the growth, the results, the positive results of the policies, the desired results are being attained, right? Manufacturing sector contracted because of the cost for input goods went up. So if you have costs going up, demand would drop. You'd have lower output, and so that's why the gas to shore project is important. That's why the regional energy security is important. Regional food security is important, and so forth, to bring down the cost of production for manufacturers, so that we could, in time to come, we as a region, we could have our own buffer. We could safeguard ourselves, minimize the impact of external shocks.
Definitely. Finally, gentlemen, as we conclude our conversation for today, the overall outlook for the year is projected to be somewhere, in terms of economic growth, is to be somewhere around 56%. Is it possible for us as a country to reach that goal and even surpass that goal with the trajectory that we're focusing on now? Mr. Bagondin, I'll start with you. And closing remarks, what would you want to say as well, as we continue along this path to Guyanese listening, seeing the trajectory and the advice that you would want to give to those Guyanese as well?
So the path that we're on, we are becoming an example for other countries to follow in terms from a macro economic management standpoint. We understand the dynamics. We understand, the type of policy intervention. We understand what it means to achieve broad-based and inclusive growth. That target is achievable because it's driven largely by the oil and gas sector. Output in the oil and gas sector is projected to reach, we're producing from two FPSOs right now, right? And then in 2024, a third will come, and then a fourth. So we're going to achieve that. And then you see with the Local Content Act, that is designed to extract more from the cost oil to spend in the economy. So you have shore bases going up. That shore base would drive another multiplier effect, creating employment. And so there's this spin-off effect from the oil and gas, from the services sector, to support what's happening offshore. So, when I look at the numbers, before the local content was implemented, the local spend was represented less than 1% of cost oil, up to 75%. Now, cumulatively, it's about 10%. So eventually, as we build up capacity, the idea is for that percentage of 70-75% to increase to 20-30%. So that would also be reflected in achieving that 56% growth. And then, of course, the other sectors, there are investments in the other sectors that are happening, construction continuing, housing continuing to drive. So that is going to happen.
Mr. Rambaran.
So, Shakwan, thank you. And what Joel has mentioned, of course, is important, very poignant. Whilst the numbers for the overall growth rate is very high, I like oftentimes to pay attention to the non-oil economy, because where we are in terms of the ramping up of production will naturally induce a high level of growth in the petroleum sector, in the oil economy. But the non-oil economy is projected to grow in excess of 8%. And the long-term trajectory for that growth is above what we call in economics the golden rule of growth of 4%. It's a 4.5 to 5%, and that is the trajectory. Now, for me, that is extraordinarily important. And if you look at the sectors as well as the subsectors that are poised to grow and continue to grow, even in face of mitigating circumstances, you'll find that we are on the way and already putting measures in place so as to be able to avoid natural resources curse and Dutch disease, biological extension, which is what is going to have that, which is what can have that dampening impact on where the country's prospects are. So I want to say that in my opinion, I think that the economy is poised for a rapid takeoff. I think that once weather favors, the sugar and rice sectors will rebound. Once the global conditions begin to come back to pre-pandemic types of activities, which eventually it will settle back into that equilibrium, you'll find that the manufacturing sector will continue to be strong, as well as the inclement weather that I would have spoken about earlier. That will also see the gold sector continuing to expand. But think about this though, Shaquan, before I close, how resilient the Guyanese economy is. Had it not been for those two mitigating circumstances which affected, as I would have mentioned, three sectors, as well as the gold sector, if it had not been for mitigating circumstances, all of the sectors in the Guyanese economy would have grown. And all of them would have experienced strong growth. There was a time in this economy where we did not have strong growth in things like wholesale and retail trade. We did not have strong growth in construction. Those are non-traditional sectors that are carrying the weight of the Guyanese economy now. And so it speaks very strongly to not just the retooling and upskilling and diversification of the Guyanese economy, but also the resilience of the Guyanese economy, which it has continued to demonstrate time and over that it does have. I think we need to, however, Shaquan, in a subsequent program, deal with this issue of natural resources curse, and perhaps really explain to the viewers out there what the natural resources curse is, what the mechanisms through which they operate in and through are, and how we can act, what steps we are already taking and have taken as Guyana to mitigate. Because in my view, we are not suffering from the natural resources curse, and once you understand the mechanisms through which the mitigating factors operate through, then you will find that we are well on the way to avoiding the natural resources curse.
Mr. Rambaran, Mr. Bagwandin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion here on the Mid-Year Report 2022.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Mr. Richard Rambaran and Mr. Joel Bagwandin, two very brilliant young men, on the Mid-Year Report 2022. For more information on the report, feel free to visit the Ministry of Finance website, their Facebook page, and educate yourself on what is happening here in Guyana. I'm your host, Shaquan Gill, saying goodbye for now.